Some women don't fend for themselves. They feed off others for money and murder. A new bride desires a wealthy life without her groom.
All for her own greed in receiving an insurance payout.
A blonde beauty uses her skills of seduction to turn lover against lover.
She was always able to manipulate men, and if she wanted murder, she got it.
And an unfaithful wife orders a hit on her helpless husband.
Investigators found text messages, and that started to put the dots together between these three people.
There was nothing that would point to her becoming a murderer.
It's breast cancer.
None of that turned out to be true about her, though. Something was wrong here.
He had been married also and divorced and had 2 children. And when they met, they fell in love.
It's lovely.
But it seems she's waiting in vain.
You really like it?
Yuloma began to see the writing on the wall. She probably wasn't going to get a ring.
Hey, look what I got.
There are no wedding bells, but Will gives Yuloma and her 16-year-old daughter everything else.
Wow, it's beautiful.
Just like your mother.
Even his home.
When Will and Yuloma got together, the whole family moved in. Will was a really hard worker, trying to create as much money as he could to provide for his family and move them into a better situation.
You kids behave yourselves.
Of course.
Will even tolerates the daughter's 19-year-old boyfriend, Chad Paget.
Chad was a kind of a low-level weed dealer.
That boy's no good.
Well, he's the father of her child.
They just seemed to rub each other the wrong way.
He still ain't no good.
But despite that, Will allowed Chad to stay in the home with them.
Will was a catch, and Yuloma was a lucky woman to be with him.
But it's not enough. Yuloma wants more, and she wants it now.
Hey, hey.
Yuloma is getting very impatient, so she devises a plan. She's gonna force him into marrying her. And how is she gonna do that?
What did the doctor say?
It's breast cancer.
Not pregnancy. No, stage 4 breast cancer.
Yuloma pretends to be terminally ill.
That's all right. There are wonderful treatments out there. You can beat this stuff, huh?
Not that I can afford.
She had told Will that she didn't have the insurance that would cover what kind of treatments she would need.
You just jump on my insurance.
But we're not married.
Well, we can change that today. Would you marry me? Is that a yes?
Yes.
So of course Will said, marry me, and you can get my health insurance.
In 2013, after 8 years of waiting, Mrs. Walker thinks she's hit the jackpot.
That's when Will got promoted to lieutenant, which earned him a good pay raise. They put aside enough money to put a down payment on a house in Madison, Ohio, and they were getting ready to move.
A new house and legally married. Stage 1 of Yuloma's financial plan is underway.
She was quite an avid shopper. Yuloma is known as someone who was really well put together, had her hair done, seemed to always be dressed nice.
A fake illness is the perfect excuse for a spending spree.
Are you opening a store?
Well, I need a little retail therapy to cheer me up.
And her loving husband
That's beautiful.
makes sure she has everything she needs by working 4 jobs.
Well, I'm just here to get changed real quick.
Are you working tonight?
Oh, yeah.
Will was a very stand-up guy. He was way up there.
But the hard work only goes so far. his money starts to dry up.
She didn't have the type of income that would have supported essentially the lifestyle she was trying to live.
Yoloma may not know how to budget, but she's a fabulous liar.
Yoloma is using William's name and social security number, opening up credit cards, getting bank loans.
She had a couple of credit cards taken out in Will's name that he was unaware of.
William, working his butt off, doesn't know anything about it.
But when you build your house on a mountain of lies, something's gotta give.
Yoloma went out and raked up tens of thousands of dollars worth of debt on Will's credit cards. She really knew she was in trouble when they got those credit card bills. She couldn't handle them.
Mom, are you okay?
Yoloma feels that the window of opportunity is closing here and that William is going to find out about her secrets.
I need your help, baby girl.
Yuloma's solution to the problem was to recruit her juvenile daughter
Chad.
and the daughter's drug-dealing boyfriend.
It's time for stage 2 of Yoloma's plan.
Mom needs your help.
What's up?
Mrs. Walker's big payday.
You know what we talked about before?
Lieutenant William Walker had an insurance policy. Yoloma believed that she was the beneficiary of that insurance policy, and that was for approximately $500,000.
We gotta do it.
William, Yoloma knows, is worth more dead than he is alive.
You'll have to be waiting there for the gun. And when he gets back, you'll have to shoot him.
It wasn't enough for Yoloma to conspire to kill a man that was very, very good to her. She made it a family event.
In Cleveland, Ohio, Yoloma Curry Walker has recruited her teenage daughter and her boyfriend to kill her husband.
Yoloma was so confident, she boasted, "I'll get away with it. Who would think I would hire a bunch of kids to kill my husband?"
Chad Paget is ready to help, but he doesn't want to get his hands dirty. He recruits 21-year-old friend Ryan Doherty.
Are we all in?
What's in it for me?
Ryan Doherty was a low-functioning individual, not a very high IQ, and had agreed to be the gunman for some weed and a couple $100.
You know, sometimes all it takes for murder is just asking the question.
Are we clear on the plan?
Yoloma thinks she has a foolproof plan.
Yoloma explains that she'd like it to appear like a robbery.
It's gotta be tonight.
She tells them, pull Will's pants pockets out so it looks like you went through his pockets, and that way that'll kind of throw the investigators off a little bit.
On the evening of November 3rd, 2013, Yoloma sets the stage to turn her living husband
Hey, babe, have I shown you this?
into cold, hard cash.
We'll have a separate dining room in the new place. It's fantastic.
Speaking of dining, I'm starving. Do you think you could get the takeout now?
Sure, no problem.
So in order to set Will up, Yoloma sends him out for some fast food.
When he leaves, she texts the murder squad back in the basement and says, it's on. So when William comes back, Ryan is waiting. Ryan pops out behind those garbage bins. And he pumps 4 rounds into William, dropping him to the ground.
When she hears the gunshots, she rushes out to the driveway and she sees Will laid out on the concrete, bleeding. She gets on her phone and she calls 911 and puts on the performance of a lifetime.
It's my husband. He's a fireman. Please, he's been shot.
Yoloma's acting can't hide the first in a series of mistakes.
You would just instinctively go to the person you love if they've just been shot and start trying to revive them. But there's no evidence of that. So suspicion number one. Here is the grieving wife whose husband has just been gunned down, but there's no blood on her.
It's not unheard of for a robbery victim to be shot more than once, but it's extremely unusual. To shoot someone 4 times just to steal a wallet is suspect.
William Walker dies in the hospital later that night, with no idea his wife is his killer.
You know, Will gave Yuloma everything, and what she gave him in return was a bullet.
While her behavior is suspicious, there is no evidence to tie Yuloma to the murder. She's free to begin her new, cashed-up life.
She packs her bags and she moves into the new house in Madison, Ohio. It's about this time that Yuloma gets some bad news.
You'll receive around $20,000 in the firefighter fund.
And his pension?
Yuloma neglects to check the most important detail of her plan, the paperwork.
No, that goes to his daughter.
Insurance?
His daughter and his ex-wife.
She doesn't get a dime from Will's life insurance or pension,
Here's your copy.
as Will neglected to list her as a beneficiary on those policies.
Will's first wife and children were the beneficiaries. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when Yuloma found out.
The murder of William Walker is unsolved for 12 months until a reward inspires a breakthrough. An informant comes forward, claiming he was offered the job by Chad Paget.
Why do you want to kill him? Not me, my girlfriend's mom. She wants dead.
The informant turned the job down, but he did have the sense to record Chad offered him money to kill Will.
We know everything that went down.
The truth unravels at lightning speed.
And we have your DNA in a shell casing.
Who is Yuloma?
Chad said that it was Yuloma who directed this hit against her husband.
Stand up, put your hands behind your back.
The dominoes fall. They bring in her daughter, and what does she do? She gives up her own mother.
All right, let's go.
If I've said it once, I've said it 1,000,000 times. There is no honor among thieves. Somebody's gonna talk.
I feel like I had no choice.
Yuloma tries to lay blame for her crime on the victim himself.
Stand up for me. Please put your hands behind your back.
You don't understand. He beat me.
She says he beat her, he was mean, he emotionally abused her.
I could have died.
But her lies are finally exposed.
None of which is true. It's the abuse excuse. She tried to play that card, and it did not work for her.
In 2016, Chad Paget pleads guilty to involuntary manslaughter with conspiracy and is sentenced to 28 years in prison. Ryan Doherty pleads guilty to aggravated murder and is sentenced to 23 years to life. As a minor, her daughter pleads guilty to delinquency and serves 1 month detention.
Yuloma ruined not only William Walker's life, but then she ruined her daughter's life, all for her own greed in receiving an insurance payout.
Yuloma Curry Walker is found guilty of aggravated murder and conspiracy. She is sentenced in 2017 to life in prison with no parole.
The fact that Yuloma really thought that she was going to get away with this just kind of demonstrates how out of touch with reality she really was.
Yuloma's grand financial plan came up empty and achieved nothing but pain for those who loved her.
No empathy, no sorrow, nothing. She's a cold-hearted sociopath, and she'll die in prison.
There's a special place in hell for people who pretend to have a terminal illness to get money or sympathy from another person. She was only dangerous to half the population of the world.
What's your back?
She's a black widow.
Melbourne, Australia, 2002. Few men can resist the beauty of 29-year-old casino worker Robin Lindham.
Men seemed to fall under a spell with incredible ease. She worked in an exclusive room where she began to meet some very colourful clientele.
Looking good, babe. Looking good.
Including drug dealer, 35-year-old George Tesis.
Could you, babe? Thank you.
George was deeply involved in the gang world.
They made their money by raiding drug houses, stealing the drugs and the cash.
Robin wants to make her own easy money to fulfill a dream of owning a horse farm.
What are we celebrating?
I have a new job.
She puts her best assets to work.
It's heaps more money.
Yeah.
Your girlfriend is now an exotic dancer.
And she knows she's good looking, she becomes a stripper.
With her lover's blessing, Robin rakes in the cash as an exotic dancer. But it's not the big money she craves.
Robin was fully aware that men would do anything for her and would pay a lot. So she went from stripping to being a high-end escort.
10 a.m. Mm-hmm. Is he a regular of mine? Yeah, I remember him. Okay.
Hey, babe, I'll be late tonight. I won't be home in time for dinner, all right?
In early 2003, a knock on the door brings the couple's high life to an abrupt end.
Show me your hands!
George is arrested for drug possession.
I'm arresting you for the possession and the cultivation of a prohibited substance.
She was making great money. Everything was fine until George was arrested.
I love you, babe. They called the lawyer.
And he went to jail for 5 months.
Robin doesn't waste time crying into her pillow. She gets straight back to work.
She's been seduced by the high life, the glitz and the glamour.
Never one to put her romance on hold, she immediately took up with a guy named Wayne.
44-year-old Wayne Amy is not like the other men in Robin's life.
That was quite a performance.
You aim to please?
Do you ever do private shows?
Listen, mate, yeah, I do.
Wayne Amy, of all the people in Robin's life, he was a straight guy, a straighty 180, as they say. He was a personal trainer, he played hockey. His friends described him as a happy-go-lucky guy.
But there's one thing he has in common with the men in Robin's orbit.
I know a little place down the road if you,
Right.
after you.
He falls completely under her spell.
Hey, fellas.
He was crazy about Robin.
The other man in her life, George Tesis, is due to be released from prison.
Yeah. Yes. Okay.
George's view of their relationship was vastly different than reality.
Yeah, I'll see you later. Bye. He must be excited. Oh, that wasn't George. He wasn't.
She was continuing to see Wayne on the side.
Then who? My hot new guy.
She told one friend she was having an affair with Wayne and that it was time for her to get rid of George.
On May 2nd, 2005, the couple is celebrating George's freedom.
It's going down quick. I think he's enjoying that.
Robin invited a friend, Matilda, over. They all had dinner and then started drinking brandy and smoking pot.
It's always lovely song.
Here he is. Yeah. It's his favourite. George, sit down.
By late evening, George wasn't just drunk, he was incredibly stoned as well.
You better stay there, I think.
Robin is more in control of her senses. She makes an excuse to leave the house with Matilda.
Hey, George. I'm just going to drop Matilda home because she forgot to leave some lunch money out for her son. Okay?
Yeah, that's all right.
Okay.
But Robin has a more sinister reason for leaving George alone.
Bye.
See you later. Bye.
Robin set her plan in motion to murder George, but she didn't want to do it alone.
What did you forget?
In fact, she didn't want to do it at all.
Is there somebody there?
She got Wayne to do it. George was never seen again, and his body was never found.
While George's distraught family search for answers to his disappearance, Robin moves on and in with Wayne. They're living the high life because they steal more than George's life.
And their lifestyle had been funded by the sale of George's assets.
Robin uses her windfall to fulfill a lifetime dream.
What she really wanted was to live in the country and raise horses. And she convinced Wayne to help her buy it.
Hey! Get off my property!
But the dream is fleeting. Robin and Wayne soon fall behind on their mortgage payments.
This causes real tensions between them.
The problem isn't Robin. It's not yours, it's ours.
They were in financial straits.
On the outskirts of Melbourne, Australia, in 2010, a relationship built on lies, murder, and false hopes is falling apart.
They've gone from a situation where they had a lot of money, living in a penthouse. Now all of a sudden, they've got a lot of debt. They can't service it.
It's all I've got left. Just let me have my dream.
We'll let the courts decide that, won't we?
Wayne sought counsel as to how to handle the farm and was advised you have to sell it.
Wayne wants his share of the property.
You make my life any harder, you'll regret it.
Robin was furious because it was the only asset that she actually had left from all of her working life.
Watch your back.
Robin has no intention of letting the courts determine her fate. She goes back to what she does best, seducing men for financial gain.
She's leading an extraordinary life, and all these men are prepared to do almost anything to make her happy.
Just do this one thing for me.
And you'll be my wife. Forever and ever and ever.
Promise.
Her latest conquest is 43-year-old Torsten Trebert. Like her other lovers, he is willing to do anything Robin asks of him.
Robin introduced another friend of hers, John Ryan, to Torsten. She told them she wanted Wayne dead, and they were happy to oblige.
On December 10th, 2013, she solves her woes without lifting a finger.
Robin gave her two new partners in crime a garage pass to where Wayne lived. When Wayne came in, they jumped him.
It was a vicious attack with a baseball bat, and then they even used a taser.
He's actually still alive. They bundle him into the car.
You don't have to do this, guys. She's crazy, man. Don't listen to her. No!
Everything all good?
I'll do anything.
Yeah.
They decide to murder Wayne outside of Melbourne.
As they were driving, they heard Wayne making noise in the trunk. So they pulled over
Please.
and they stabbed him 4 times.
How is he not dead? Use the rope.
At that point, they've strangled Wayne to death.
Finally.
Wayne had so many injuries in his body that the coroner was unable to actually explain what was the specific cause of death.
Wayne Amy's body is dumped in the woods.
Wayne knew better than anyone he was dealing with a deadly woman. He helped her kill her first boyfriend. He should have taken her more seriously.
But this time, Robin isn't home free. Her accomplices have loose lips. Within hours, police receive a tip-off about the deadly trio.
The brain trust of Robin, Torsten, and John was swimming in the shallow end of the gene pool, and that's how they were caught so quickly.
In 2015, all 3 are arrested and charged with murder.
John and Torsten both pleaded not guilty and tried to blame each other.
They are both convicted. John Ryan is sentenced to 31 years and Torsten Trabert to 28 years. The mastermind, Robin Lindum, pleads guilty and receives 25 years.
Robin's guilty plea worked in her favor because she received the lightest sentence.
But the law isn't done with Robin. The police reopen the investigation into George Teeses's disappearance. And a crucial witness from the past comes forward.
Matilda, the woman who was with Robin on the night George disappeared, she breaks her silence. She tells the police that hours after George was killed, Robin confessed.
In 2019, Robin receives an additional 28 years for George's murder.
Despite constant pleas from George's family, Robin has never divulged where his body is.
Robin used her charm and beauty to turn her lovers into killers.
Robin was an evil seductress. She liked to have men around her little finger.
She was always able to manipulate men to get what she wanted. And if she wanted murder, she got it. Some women don't care about humans. They care about money.
We could be together.
And they care that the money is in their purse. Period.
McKinney, Texas, 2014. 65-year-old Englishman,
There we go.
Richard Moore,
Trust me.
and 31-year-old Texas car salesman, Stephen Brockway, may not have the same tastes.
It's an acquired taste.
No way, man. I like my beer icy cold.
But they're good friends.
He would come over for dinner at Richard's home pretty regularly. He would hang out, have drinks together.
Cheers.
Richard and Stephen considered themselves best friends.
Come on, let's eat.
Okay.
Richard's 33-year-old wife, Chansamorn, becomes accustomed to cooking for 3.
Chansamorn called Richard and Stephen the 2 boys whenever they would hang out together.
They married 4 years earlier. Richard does his best to make Thailand native Chansamorn feel at home in Texas.
He bought her a lot. He provided for her comfort, her and her 2 daughters. He was really trying to make a go of this relationship and have a good life.
Richard doesn't know it, but his close friend Stephen is even closer to his wife.
No more, thanks. Look, it's my bedtime. No, you stay. I stay.
In addition to the friendship growing between the 2 men, there was a special friendship growing between Stephen and his friend's wife.
Cheers.
Awesome dinner. Stephen was in his 30s, so he and Chance Moore were about the same age. The 2 of them eventually became very close.
Richard has no reason to doubt the loyalty of his wife and friend until a chance discovery late one night in 2014.
Richard decided to go to bed early. And in the middle of the night, when he was getting a glass of water, he noticed that Stephen's car was still out front. So he went poking around and he saw Chance Moore and Stephen in bed together under the sheets, asleep.
It's a heartbreaking betrayal.
They were either so drunk they fell asleep, or they just didn't care if Richard found out. And when he saw them sleeping together, it broke his heart.
The next morning, Richard is in no mood for excuses.
Good morning.
Richard had a lot to deal with.
You didn't come to bed.
I didn't want to wake you.
Don't lie to me.
Not only was his wife in bed with another man, that other man was Richard's best friend.
We were talking and fell asleep.
Please, just don't.
A lot going on there.
Richard calls for a timeout.
I'm going on holiday. Alone.
He spends several weeks in Bangkok, considering his options. He returns home to an icy reception and is banished to the guest bedroom.
Chance Moore was really frustrated with her relationship with Richard.
Incredibly, cheating Chansamorn turns the tables on Richard and accuses him of being unfaithful.
Chansamone suspected Richard was having an affair, but there's no evidence that he was cheating on her.
In early 2015, her jealousy turns to rage.
Richard is lying in bed, watching a movie.
And her rage leaps to a completely irrational conclusion.
And Chance Moore came to him and accused him of some sort of conversation with another woman.
Who are you talking to?
No one, I'm watching a movie.
They got into an altercation, and Chance Moore bit Richard on the arm.
You crazy woman! What are you doing?
Biting from one adult to another is a savage act. There's no coming back for a relationship in which one person savagely bites the other. Pack your bags, get in the car, go away.
Chansamorn knows her marriage is headed for divorce. But an ex-husband is worth far less to her than a dead husband.
Chance Moore thought she was going to get Richard's life insurance policy, which was worth about $1 million.
If I was in Thailand, I'd have him killed.
Chansamone brought up the idea of killing Richard.
We could be together.
Her lover, Stephen, is happy to lend a hand to kill his best friend.
People get killed all over the world.
Stephen jumped right in that party. Yep, people get killed all the time, let's do it.
I might know someone.
But they don't want to get their own hands dirty.
Stephen reached out to a marijuana dealer that he knew named Ronald Rosser, who lived out in East Texas.
Ron Rosser had a checkered past.
He had a DWI. In fact, in one instance, he crashed his car into a fence post and it took out an eye.
Hello, Stephen.
Stephen offers Ronald $10,000 to do the job. It's a short-sighted long shot, but it pays off. Ronald agrees.
When Stephen decided to pay Ron to kill Richard, Stephen was scraping the bottom of the hitman barrel.
February 27th, 2015, begins like any other for Richard. He's a creature of habit who keeps a strict routine.
Everything about his life was set to a routine, so he would have tea in the morning at a certain time.
He'd maybe do some chores around the house, and then mid-morning would go take a shower. He was very regimented in that way.
It makes him an easy target for a contract killer. Outside, a rare and powerful snowstorm hits the area. Yet Chansamorn chooses that exact moment to run some errands.
Chansamorn left the house to go to a department store to go pay a bill.
Chansamorn's creating an alibi and ensuring her hired killer has easy access to the house. She keeps in close contact with her co-conspirator, Stephen.
Stephen was texting with Chansamorn to make sure that she was out of the house so that Rosser would be able to come in.
Ronald knew exactly where to go because Richard lived his life on a schedule, and he went to the master bedroom.
Richard has no idea of the danger lurking right outside the door.
He pointed a rifle at his face and shot him the first time through his forearm and then struck him in the face. And he was shot an additional 7 or 8 times solely in the head.
Ronald must not have been very sure of himself. It is absolutely not necessary to shoot someone more than one time in the head to kill them, but that's what he did.
Ronald's payment has been prearranged.
There was around $10,000 in that safe, and that was going to be Ronald's payment for committing this murder.
Later that afternoon, Chansamorn returns home to play the grieving widow.
A lot of money is missing, thousands of dollars.
Immediately, she starts talking about all this money missing from the safe.
Did you have any problems in the relationship?
No, we were very happy.
It would be helpful if we could go through your phone.
Why?
It could help.
But when investigators examine Chansamorn's phone, they discover dozens of text messages between the victim's widow and his best friend that tell another story.
I don't think Chansamorn and her boyfriend watch too much true crime or crime fiction.
Are you going to be able to leave the house in this bad weather? Yes.
Or they wouldn't have been saying the things they were saying on their cell phones.
To the investigators' surprise, before they go looking for Stephen, he turns up at the police station.
Stephen brought his own handgun to, he said, rule him out as a suspect.
That's my only gun. I thought you might want to test it.
No, sir. No need for that.
He brought in his own revolver to show them it hadn't been fired, but no one knew how Richard had been killed. It wasn't public information that he had been shot.
Can I have a look at your phone, sir?
Investigators found text messages to Ronald the day of the murder, and that started to put the dots together between these 3 people.
All 3 are charged with capital murder.
In the state of Texas, it didn't matter if you were the one to pull the trigger, you still get the same charge.
In 2019, Ronald Rosser is found guilty of capital murder. He is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Ron was a two-bit convicted felon, the worst person they could have chosen. He had nothing going on upstairs.
Stephen Brockway pleads guilty to murder and agrees to testify at Chansamorn's trial. He receives a reduced sentence of 28 years.
As soon as the first person is arrested, the house falls apart.
Faced with the overwhelming evidence against her, Chansamorn Pokai pleads guilty to murder. She is sentenced to 40 years in prison.
The fact that Chansamorn received a 40-year sentence was extremely satisfying to us. We knew that Chansamorn was behind this.
Chansamorn treated people like commodities. She wanted everything for nothing. But in the end, she got what she paid for.
This woman wasn't looking for love. She was looking for a wallet.
These deadly women loved cash more than their men.
It begins with a sound that no one remembers clearly anymore. Maybe the dull thud of a car door closing. Maybe the low hum of a highway cutting through cornfields under a moonless Ohio sky. Maybe nothing at all. Just the absence that followed. The moment when a routine night quietly tipped into something irreversible and a name was about to be whispered for years with the same uneasy question attached to it. What really happened? In the summer of 2007, Ohio felt still and ordinary, the kind of place where days passed unmarked and neighbors recognized the same cars parked in the same driveways, and on one unremarkable evening a young woman failed to come home. Not dramatically, not with a scream or a struggle anyone could swear to hearing, but softly, like a light switched off in a room no one was watching. By morning, concern crept in, thin at first, then heavier with every unanswered call, every hour that stretched without explanation, until the word missing began to harden into something colder, something that made people lower their voices when they said it. Police logged the report the way they logged hundreds of others. A few details, a last known location, a description that seemed painfully insufficient, and they drove the roads she was known to take, the parking lots she passed through, the bars and gas stations lit by fluorescent glare, asking questions that produced shrugs and half-memories. A clerk who thought she saw someone like her. A driver who remembered a car that might have been blue or might have been black. There was no blood, no wreckage, no obvious crime scene to tape off, just a life paused mid-sentence. And as the hours turned into days, the case slipped quietly into that uncomfortable category investigators never like to name too soon. The one that carries weight and expectation and dread, a cold case in the making. Flyers went up on telephone poles, her face staring out from photocopied paper, smiling in a way that felt almost accusatory as weeks passed, and the smile remained unchanged while everything else moved on. The town absorbed the shock the way small communities do, by talking and speculating and watching each other more closely than before, by locking doors that had always been left open, by glancing twice at passing cars, by telling children to check in when they arrived somewhere safely. Rumors formed quickly and stubbornly, whispered theories about secret boyfriends, about debts, about arguments that might have flared in private moments no one else saw, and each theory flared bright for a moment before collapsing under its own lack of proof. Detectives followed what little they had, phone records that showed nothing unusual, bank cards untouched, a vehicle found abandoned where it shouldn't have been, clean and silent and offering no answers. The absence of evidence became its own kind of evidence, a void that swallowed every attempt to fill it, and with each dead end the case cooled further, the file growing thicker, while the hope inside it thinned. Years passed the way they always do, indifferently, and Ohio changed in small, forgettable ways while the name at the center of the case became a reference point for loss, a reminder dragged out whenever another person went missing, whenever someone asked how a community could let something like that happen and never know why. New detectives inherited the file, flipped through photographs already worn soft at the edges, reread statements taken when memories were still fresh, and felt the same familiar frustration. the sense of arriving late to a conversation that had already ended. Technology advanced, DNA databases expanded, cold case units promised renewed focus, but the core problem remained untouched. There was nothing solid to hold on to, no clear suspect, no confession, no trail that didn't dissolve after a few steps. The case became a ghost that haunted the department, present but intangible, invoked but unresolved. The family lived with a different version of time, one measured not in years but in anniversaries and unanswered holidays, in chairs left empty and phone calls that never came, their grief transforming slowly into something harder and quieter, a constant pressure that never fully released. They spoke to the media when asked, pleaded for tips, learned to brace themselves for every knock on the door, every late-night call that might finally bring clarity or confirmation, and each time it didn't, the wound reopened and closed again, leaving thicker scars. They learned the language of investigation against their will, learned what it meant when police said there were no new leads, learned how hope could be both a lifeline and a trap. Then, without warning, the story lurched back into motion, not with a dramatic discovery or a long-awaited tip, but with something so mundane it almost defied belief. A routine traffic stop. Years later, miles away, a car pulled over for a minor violation, flashing lights cutting through the dark the way they always had, an officer approaching with the practiced calm of someone expecting nothing more than paperwork and a brief delay. There was no sense of destiny in that moment, no indication that the past was about to surface through the smallest crack in the present. But names have a way of resurfacing when no one expects them to, and a check run through a system now far more connected than it had been in 2007 produced a flicker of recognition, a pause, a second look at a screen, the kind of hesitation that shifts the air inside a patrol car. What followed did not explode outward immediately. It unfolded slowly, cautiously, as pieces that had never fit were lifted and examined again under new light. Old evidence was retrieved from storage, dusted off both literally and figuratively, and what once seemed inert began to speak in fragments. A sample too degraded to matter years ago now yielded something usable. A timeline once riddled with gaps could be cross-referenced against data that hadn't existed at the time. Witness statements dismissed as unreliable took on new significance when aligned differently, their inconsistencies forming a pattern instead of a problem. The case, long considered frozen, began to thaw in uneven, unsettling ways. Investigators moved quietly at first, aware of the weight they were carrying, aware that reopening a cold case meant reopening wounds, raising expectations that might once again be crushed if the trail went cold again. They re-interviewed people who had aged alongside the case, whose recollections had softened and shifted, whose lives had moved on but whose expressions changed the moment the old name was spoken. Some were cooperative, some defensive, some visibly shaken by the realization that the past was no longer safely buried. The routine traffic stop remained the spark no one could quite explain, the unlikely hinge on which everything now turned, a reminder that chance plays an uncomfortable role in justice. As the investigation accelerated, the community felt the tremor even before details became public. Whispers spread that the Ohio 2007 cold case was no longer dormant, that something had changed, that an arrest might finally be possible. Excitement tangled with fear, because answers, when they arrive after so long, rarely bring the clean relief people imagine. They bring complexity, they bring uncomfortable truths, they bring the realization that the person responsible may have been living in plain sight all along, passing unnoticed through grocery store aisles and school events, blending seamlessly into the background of everyday life. When the arrest finally came, it landed with a force sharpened by the years of waiting, a headline that felt almost unreal as it flashed across screens and newspapers, the words "cold case broken" echoing with disbelief and grim validation. A suspect in custody, charges filed, the machinery of the justice system grinding back into motion for a crime that had nearly slipped beyond its reach. For some, it was a moment of vindication, proof that persistence and technology and chance could converge to pierce even the thickest fog of time. For others, it raised new questions that felt just as heavy as the old ones, questions about missed signs, about opportunities lost, about how many years a truth can hide before it finally surfaces. Yet, even with an arrest, the case did not resolve itself neatly, did not settle into a comfortable narrative with a clear moral arc. Details emerged slowly and selectively, filtered through court documents and official statements, each revelation stirring fresh unease. The routine traffic stop that cracked the case open now seemed almost cruel in its simplicity, a reminder that the difference between anonymity and exposure can hinge on something as small as a broken taillight. The community grappled with the dual shock of recognition and denial, struggling to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the allegations now attached to his name. As the legal process loomed, the family stood once more in the public eye, their expressions etched with a complicated mix of grief, anger, and cautious hope, knowing that an arrest was not the same as an ending, that answers in courtrooms can be partial and painful, that no verdict could restore what had been taken. The Ohio 2007 cold case had been broken, yes, but in the breaking it revealed fractures that extended far beyond a single crime, fractures in trust, in memory, in the comforting illusion that the past stays buried if you leave it alone. And so the story presses forward from that traffic stop into territory both familiar and treacherous, where evidence must speak louder than headlines, where old secrets resist exposure even under oath, and where the true cost of a cold case is measured not just in years, but in the lingering silence that follows every answer, the silence that reminds a town, a family, and a system that some echoes never fully fade, no matter how long they have waited to be heard. The problem with reopening a cold case after so many years is not that there are too many answers, but that there are suddenly too many questions competing for the same narrow space, all of them demanding attention, all of them threatening to collapse the fragile structure investigators are trying to rebuild. In Ohio, as the shock of the arrest settled into something heavier and more complicated, detectives found themselves standing in a landscape that had been altered by time, where streets had been repaved, businesses had closed and reopened under new names, and people had rewritten their own histories so many times they no longer remembered which version was true. Every step forward required digging through layers of memory, and memory, they knew, was a material that warped easily under pressure. They went back to the beginning, to the night in 2007 that had always refused to stay still, replaying it frame by frame with the benefit of hindsight and the burden of responsibility. The timeline that once seemed straightforward now looked jagged, full of small inconsistencies that had been dismissed as noise but now hummed with potential meaning. A phone call placed but never fully explained. A witness who changed their story just enough to raise an eyebrow, but not enough to trigger suspicion. A gap of minutes that no one could account for, a blank space that had been circled in red ink and then quietly ignored because there was nothing to put inside it. Now that blank space felt like a wound that had never healed properly. The suspect, once just another name buried in paperwork, became a focal point around which everything else began to rearrange itself. His movements in 2007 were reconstructed from fragments, receipts yellowed with age, employment records that showed when he clocked in and out, a neighbor's vague recollection of a car leaving late at night. None of it was definitive on its own, but together it formed a silhouette that was difficult to unsee. Investigators noted how often he appeared on the edges of the story without ever stepping fully into the light, how his name surfaced just often enough to be remembered and just rarely enough to be overlooked. It was the kind of presence that only made sense in retrospect, the kind that feels obvious only after the fact. As word spread that the case was moving again, the town responded with a mix of anticipation and defensiveness. People who had once spoken freely now measured their words, aware that what they said could carry consequences they had not considered 15 years earlier. Old friendships were reevaluated, casual interactions re-examined for hidden meaning, and the familiar discomfort returned, the sense that the safety people believed they had reclaimed after 2007 might have been an illusion all along. Conversations lowered in volume when certain names were mentioned, and social media filled the gaps left by official silence with speculation, accusation, and amateur analysis, each post amplifying the tension. The investigators felt the pressure from all sides. There was the expectation of closure from a family that had waited far too long, the scrutiny of a public hungry for details, and the quiet, relentless ticking of the legal clock. Every piece of evidence had to withstand not just the passage of time, but the scrutiny of defense attorneys eager to exploit every inconsistency, every lost record, every procedural misstep made by people who could not have known in 2007 what they would be asked to justify years later. Chain of custody became a phrase repeated like a prayer, and every box pulled from storage carried the risk of disappointment. They re-examined the physical evidence with methods that had not existed when the case first went cold, aware that technology could be both a savior and a liability. A sample that now produced a partial profile also raised uncomfortable questions about why it had not been prioritized earlier. New analysis confirmed some long-held assumptions while undermining others, forcing the team to accept that parts of their original narrative had been built on shaky ground. It was not enough to prove what might have happened. They had to demonstrate what did happen, beyond reasonable doubt, in a courtroom where sympathy would not substitute for certainty. Meanwhile, the suspect remained mostly silent, his public image shaped by mugshots and court appearances that revealed little beyond a carefully maintained neutrality. Those who knew him offered conflicting descriptions, some insisting they saw no sign of violence or cruelty, others recalling moments that now felt sinister in retrospect. The duality unsettled the community, the realization that a person could move through daily life, attend gatherings, exchange pleasantries, all while carrying secrets that would later redefine them in the public eye. It forced an uncomfortable reflection on how well anyone truly knows the people around them. As the case advanced, journalists dug deeper, unearthing old articles, tracking down former officers, reconstructing the early days of the investigation in long-form features that blurred the line between reporting and storytelling. The phrase Ohio 2007 cold case became a headline fixture, accompanied by timelines and diagrams and carefully selected quotes that promised clarity while often delivering more ambiguity. Each new piece of information reignited debates that had never been fully resolved about police resources, about whose voices were believed, about how many other cases might still be waiting for the same combination of luck and persistence. For the family, the renewed attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it felt like validation, proof that their loved one had not been forgotten, that the years of waiting and advocating had finally led somewhere tangible. On the other, it meant reliving the worst moments of their lives in public, watching strangers dissect intimate details, and confronting the possibility that the answers they had long sought might not bring the peace they imagined. Closure, they were learning, was not a destination but a negotiation, a fragile state that could be disrupted at any moment by a new revelation or a legal setback. Inside the investigation, doubt remained a constant companion. Detectives questioned their own interpretations, aware of the danger of tunnel vision, the temptation to force the evidence to fit the narrative suggested by the arrest. They reminded each other that a cold case broken did not automatically mean a case solved, that an arrest was only one step in a process that demanded rigor and restraint. They revisited alternative theories, tested them against the emerging facts, and confronted the uncomfortable possibility that some questions might remain unanswered no matter how hard they searched. The closer they came to trial, the more the weight of the years pressed down on everyone involved. Witnesses worried about their ability to recall events accurately, prosecutors worried about how those memories would appear under cross-examination, and defense attorneys prepared to argue that time itself had corrupted the truth beyond repair. The courtroom loomed as a stage where the past would be reconstructed in fragments, where jurors would be asked to piece together a story from evidence that had survived fires, floods, and neglect, and decide whether it added up to guilt beyond doubt. Outside, life continued in uneasy parallel. Children who had not been born in 2007 learned about the case as a historical footnote, while older residents found themselves unexpectedly emotional at the mention of a name they had tried to forget. The traffic stop that had triggered everything now took on a mythic quality, cited again and again as proof that justice could arrive through the most ordinary of circumstances. But beneath that narrative lay a more troubling truth, that justice had also been delayed by the same ordinariness, by the ease with which a person could blend into the background and let time do the work of erasure. As the Ohio 2007 cold case moved through this new phase, it carried with it all the unresolved tension of a story that refused to settle. Each development answered one question only to expose another. Each step forward illuminated the shadows rather than dispelling them. The case was no longer frozen, but it was far from at rest, suspended in a state of uneasy motion where the past pressed relentlessly against the present, and everyone involved sensed that whatever the outcome, the echo of that night would continue to shape the town long after the verdict was read. Time, once an enemy to the investigation, now became its most unpredictable witness, bending testimony, sharpening some memories while erasing others entirely, and as the Ohio 2007 cold case edged closer to a courtroom, everyone involved began to understand that the real battle would not be fought over what happened, but over what could still be proven. The evidence, revived and reorganized, looked different when arranged for a jury rather than for an evidence board in a detective's office. What once felt compelling in isolation now had to survive the cold, methodical logic of legal scrutiny, where every claim demanded corroboration and every assumption invited attack. Prosecutors knew the story had power, but power alone could not carry a case that had waited this long to be told. They began constructing the narrative carefully, choosing which facts to foreground and which to hold back, aware that too much information could overwhelm and confuse rather than convince. The routine traffic stop that had reignited the case was positioned not as a miracle, but as a consequence of systems evolving, of databases speaking to each other in ways they once could not. This was not fate, they argued, but progress. And yet, even as they spoke, they knew how thin that distinction could sound to a jury skeptical of coincidences. The defense, for its part, leaned into that skepticism, framing the arrest as a product of desperation rather than discovery, a late attempt to assign blame where certainty had long since dissolved. Witnesses were prepared and re-prepared, their statements dissected until even the smallest inconsistency became a point of concern. Some had not spoken publicly in years, had built lives that no longer revolved around the night in question, and now found themselves pulled back into it against their will. Their recollections carried the weight of expectation, not just from the legal teams, but from a community desperate for resolution. Each witness understood that forgetting could be interpreted as lying, that hesitation could be mistaken for deception, and the pressure to remember accurately after so long became its own kind of burden. The suspect's past was examined with a new intensity, his history combed for patterns that could support or undermine the prosecution's theory. Ordinary moments were reinterpreted, casual remarks elevated to potential clues, and the mundane details of his life were laid out in stark relief against the gravity of the charges. Friends and coworkers were asked to recall conversations they had not thought about in over a decade, to attach significance to moments that had once seemed forgettable. Some complied willingly, eager to distance themselves from the growing shadow around his name. Others resisted, clinging to the belief that they had known him well enough to rule out the worst, and that belief became a fault line running through the community. Media coverage intensified as the trial approached, each new development framed as a turning point even when little had actually changed. Headlines promised revelations, commentators speculated about outcomes, and the phrase, "cold case broken," was repeated so often it began to lose its precision, becoming a shorthand for hope rather than a description of reality. The public consumed every detail hungrily, dissecting legal arguments as if they were plot twists, and in doing so blurred the boundary between justice and entertainment. For the family, this attention felt invasive and relentless, a reminder that their private grief had become public property the moment the case was reopened. Behind closed doors, doubts persisted. Prosecutors worried about the fragility of evidence that had survived years of storage, but not years of interpretation. Defense attorneys worried about the emotional weight the case carried, how easily a jury could be swayed by sympathy rather than proof. Judges weighed motions that would determine which pieces of the past were allowed into the present, aware that each ruling could tilt the balance in subtle but decisive ways. The law moved forward with its characteristic slowness, indifferent to the urgency felt by those whose lives were bound to its outcome. As opening statements loomed, the courtroom itself became a symbol of the collision between past and present, a space where the events of 2007 would be reconstructed through testimony and exhibits, where timelines would be projected onto screens and memories translated into sworn statements. Jurors were selected who had lived through the original disappearance and others who had only encountered it as a historical footnote, their perspectives shaped by different relationships to time. They were instructed to listen, to weigh, to decide, and to do so without the benefit of certainty, because certainty, in a case like this, was a luxury no one possessed. The families sat together, their presence a quiet constant amid the procedural formalities, their faces reflecting a tension that words could not fully capture. For them, the trial was not just about establishing guilt or innocence, but about reclaiming a narrative that had been frozen in ambiguity for too long. Every piece of testimony reopened old questions. Every photograph pulled them back into moments they had tried to compartmentalize in order to survive. They listened as strangers spoke about their loved one in past tense, as if the finality of language could substitute for truth. Outside the courthouse, the town watched and waited, the sense of collective anticipation tinged with anxiety. Some residents hoped for a clear verdict that would allow them to finally close a chapter they had never chosen to be part of. Others feared that the trial would expose uncomfortable truths about missed warnings and overlooked connections, about how easily a crime could hide in plain sight when people trusted familiarity over instinct. The possibility that the case might not end cleanly loomed over every conversation, a reminder that legal conclusions do not always align with emotional needs. As testimony began, the fragility of memory became impossible to ignore. Witnesses struggled to place events in sequence, to distinguish between what they remembered and what they had learned later through media and conversation. Prosecutors guided them carefully, defense attorneys pressed on the cracks, and the jury watched as the past wavered under examination. The process was meticulous and exhausting, a slow excavation of moments that resisted being pinned down. Each day ended with more questions than answers, and the sense that the truth, whatever it was, remained just out of reach. The routine traffic stop, so simple in description, grew more complex with each retelling, its significance debated and reframed until it seemed almost symbolic, a reminder that justice can hinge on chance encounters and incremental progress rather than grand revelations. It stood in stark contrast to the years of inertia that preceded it, highlighting the uncomfortable reality that the difference between a cold case and an active one can be as arbitrary as timing. That realization unsettled many, forcing a reconsideration of how many other stories might still be waiting for the same convergence of circumstances. As the Ohio 2007 cold case unfolded in this new, public arena, it became clear that breaking a cold case does not mean escaping its gravity. The years that had passed were not erased by the arrest or the trial. They lingered in every hesitation, every contradiction, every unanswered question that surfaced along the way. The process exposed not only the mechanics of a long-delayed investigation but the human cost of waiting, the toll exacted by uncertainty, and the uneasy truth that some answers, once delayed, can never fully satisfy the need that gave rise to them. And so the trial moved forward, carrying with it the accumulated weight of time, expectation, and doubt, each day adding another layer to a story that refused to simplify. The courtroom became a place where the past was neither alive nor dead, but suspended, replayed through voices that strained to capture what had once happened in the dark. Whether the verdict would bring resolution or deepen the mystery remained uncertain, but one thing was already clear: the Ohio 2007 cold case, even broken open, was far from finished with those it had touched. By the time the trial settled into its rhythm, it was no longer the shock of the arrest that defined the room, but the slow accumulation of doubt and intensity, the way each day layered another thin sheet of tension over everything that came before it. The courtroom air felt heavier as testimony stacked upon testimony, each voice adding a slightly different version of the same night, each version nudging the story a fraction of an inch in one direction or another. Jurors leaned forward, pens hovering, aware that they were being asked to do something almost impossible: reconstruct a vanished moment from 2007 using fragments that time had sanded smooth. The prosecution led with structure, anchoring their case in timelines and sequences designed to feel solid, inevitable. They traced the victim's last known movements with clinical precision, mapping out her route, her calls, her routines, transforming ordinary actions into a chain of significance. Each detail was presented as a stepping stone, meant to guide the jury toward a conclusion that felt earned rather than assumed. The defense watched closely, waiting for the moment when that chain would reveal its weakest link, because in a case this old, weakness was not an anomaly, it was a certainty. When physical evidence was introduced, it carried a peculiar duality, simultaneously powerful and fragile. Bags and boxes retrieved from storage were displayed like artifacts from another era, their contents labeled with dates that felt uncomfortably distant. Experts testified about advances in forensic science, explaining how techniques unavailable in 2007 could now extract meaning from what once seemed useless. Charts and graphs lit up screens, translating biological data into probabilities and percentages that sounded authoritative but demanded interpretation. The jury was asked to trust the science, but also to accept its limitations, to believe that something preserved imperfectly could still speak truthfully across time. Cross-examination was relentless. Defense attorneys seized on every gap, every procedural misstep that could be attributed to the early days of the investigation. Why was this sample collected but not tested? Why was that witness statement summarized rather than recorded? Why did one report contradict another written hours later? These questions echoed through the courtroom, less about the answers themselves than about planting uncertainty, reminding jurors that the case they were seeing had been shaped by years of human error and institutional constraint. The past, they argued, was not just distant, it was contaminated. Witnesses felt the strain acutely. Some entered the courtroom with confidence, only to falter when pressed on details they had not revisited in years. Others clung too tightly to rehearse narratives, their certainty raising suspicions of its own. Memory experts were called to explain how recollection degrades and reconstructs itself over time, how the mind fills in blanks with assumptions and external information. Their testimony cast a shadow over everything that had been said so far, suggesting that even the most sincere witness could be unknowingly unreliable. The truth, it seemed, was not just elusive, it was malleable. The suspect's demeanor became an unspoken subplot, analyzed by observers for signs of guilt or innocence that might not mean anything at all. He sat quietly, occasionally conferring with his attorneys, his face revealing little beyond controlled attentiveness. To some, his calm suggested detachment, even arrogance. To others, it looked like the composure of someone overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. Every glance, every shift in posture, was scrutinized as if the body might confess what words would not, a reminder of how deeply people want visual confirmation when certainty remains out of reach. Outside the courtroom, the case took on a life of its own. Commentators debated strategy and likelihoods, social media dissected testimony in real time, and amateur sleuths resurrected theories long thought dead. The routine traffic stop that had triggered the arrest was elevated almost to myth, cited as proof that justice could arrive unexpectedly, even randomly. Yet that randomness unsettled as much as it reassured, because it implied that resolution was not solely the product of diligence or merit, but of timing and chance, forces that cannot be controlled or predicted. Inside, the family listened in silence, absorbing details they had never wanted to know. Hearing the last hours of their loved one described in neutral, procedural language felt like a second violation, a reduction of a life to a sequence of actions and outcomes. They watched as strangers debated interpretations of her choices, her movements, her trust, and they felt the familiar ache of powerlessness return. The trial offered the promise of answers, but it also demanded endurance, forcing them to relive the uncertainty they had carried for years in a space where emotion was both unavoidable and irrelevant. As days turned into weeks, the narrative grew more complex rather than clearer. Evidence that seemed decisive one afternoon was reframed the next morning, its significance diminished or redirected. Jurors were instructed repeatedly to keep open minds, to avoid premature conclusions, to evaluate the totality rather than individual moments. But the totality was unwieldy, a mosaic with missing pieces and mismatched edges. The longer the trial went on, the more apparent it became that no single fact would dominate the outcome. The verdict would hinge on accumulation and interpretation, on whether the story presented felt coherent enough to outweigh its flaws. The defense emphasized the danger of confirmation bias, arguing that once the arrest was made, every subsequent action was filtered through the assumption of guilt. They suggested alternative explanations for the evidence, alternative timelines that fit just as well, if not better. They reminded the jury that the absence of other suspects did not equate to the presence of proof, that unresolved questions could not be resolved by convenience. Their message was simple and unsettling. Uncertainty itself was reasonable doubt. The prosecution countered by returning to the pattern, the way disparate elements aligned when viewed together. They acknowledged imperfections, framing them as inevitable consequences of time rather than indicators of falsehood. They argued that waiting years for justice did not diminish its validity, that the convergence of evidence now was not coincidence, but culmination. They spoke of responsibility, of the obligation to act when the picture finally came into focus, even if it arrived late. The jury was asked to believe that truth, though delayed, had not been diluted. Throughout it all, the phrase cold case hovered like a specter, shaping expectations and interpretations alike. A cold case carried a certain romance in public imagination, the idea of mystery finally unraveled, of persistence rewarded. But in the courtroom, that romance dissolved into logistics and law, into rules that cared little for narrative satisfaction. The case was not judged on how compelling it felt, but on whether it met a standard designed precisely to withstand emotion and conjecture. That standard loomed large, unforgiving, a reminder that justice is defined not by certainty, but by threshold. As closing arguments approached, fatigue set in. Jurors looked worn, their notes thick with annotations, their faces marked by the strain of sustained attention. Lawyers refined their final messages, distilling weeks of testimony into themes they hoped would resonate. The family braced themselves for another turning point, aware that whatever came next would shape not only the outcome of the trial, but the story that would endure long after it ended. The town waited, caught between anticipation and dread, sensing that the verdict, whatever it was, would ripple outward in ways no one could fully predict. The Ohio 2007 cold case, once silent and stagnant, now pulsed with urgency, its fate resting in the hands of 12 individuals tasked with navigating ambiguity. The trial had not simplified the past, it had exposed its complexity, its resistance to clean explanation. As the final phase approached, one truth became increasingly clear. Breaking a cold case does not mean breaking free from its uncertainty. It means confronting that uncertainty directly, under lights and scrutiny, and accepting that even when the system moves forward, some shadows remain stubbornly intact, trailing behind every answer like a reminder of how fragile certainty truly is. By the time closing arguments arrived, the courtroom felt stripped bare, as if weeks of testimony had scoured it down to nerves and expectation, leaving nothing cushioned or abstract. Everything now hinged on interpretation, on which version of the past the jury would find more believable, more complete, more honest in its imperfections. The lawyers spoke with a precision sharpened by repetition, each word chosen to linger, each pause calculated to let uncertainty settle where certainty could not. This was the moment when the story stopped growing and began to harden, when all the fragments presented over days and weeks were pressed together into a single shape and offered up for judgment. The prosecution went first, drawing the jury's attention back to the pattern they had been building all along, a pattern they argued could not be dismissed as coincidence or convenience. They walked through the timeline one final time, slowly, deliberately, emphasizing how each piece aligned when viewed without distraction. The routine traffic stop, they reminded the jury, did not create the evidence. It revealed it. It was not the beginning of the truth, only the point at which the truth could no longer remain hidden. They acknowledged the years of silence, the missteps, the lost opportunities, but framed them as context rather than contradiction, insisting that delay did not invalidate discovery. Justice, they said, is not measured by speed, but by accuracy. They spoke of responsibility, of the obligation to act when the picture becomes clear, even if it arrives late and imperfect. They asked the jury to consider the totality, not as a collection of isolated facts, but as a coherent narrative supported by science, testimony, and circumstance. This was not a case built on a single dramatic revelation, they argued, but on accumulation, on the quiet convergence of details that, together, pointed in one direction. The absence of a flawless timeline, they said, did not negate the presence of truth. It reflected the reality of investigating a crime buried under years of time and normalcy. When the defense rose, the tone shifted, becoming sharper, more skeptical, designed to fracture the narrative the prosecution had worked so carefully to assemble. They reminded the jury of the gaps, the contradictions, the questions that had never been satisfactorily answered. They spoke of memory as an unreliable narrator, of evidence handled by systems that were never designed to preserve certainty for this long. They argued that the very phrase "cold case broken" carried an implicit bias, a promise of resolution that the evidence itself could not fulfill. An arrest, they said, was not a conclusion and progress was not proof. They urged the jury to resist the pull of closure, to remember that wanting an answer did not make one true. They highlighted alternative explanations, other paths the investigation could have taken but did not, and suggested that focus had narrowed not because the evidence demanded it, but because the pressure to solve the case had finally reached a breaking point. Doubt, they argued, was not a flaw in the system. It was its safeguard. And in a case where time had eroded so much, doubt was not just reasonable, it was inevitable. As the lawyers finished, the judge's instructions carried a weight that felt almost physical. Jurors were reminded of their duty, of the standard they must apply, of the fact that sympathy and speculation had no place in their deliberations. They were told to evaluate the evidence carefully, to discuss it openly, and to reach a verdict based solely on what had been proven beyond reasonable doubt. The words were familiar, procedural, but in this context they sounded almost philosophical, a reminder that justice is an ideal pursued through rules precisely because certainty is so rare. Deliberations began behind closed doors, and the silence that followed was immediate and unsettling. The courtroom emptied slowly, people lingering in hallways, exchanging hushed speculation, reading meaning into the length of time that passed without a verdict. Each hour fueled new theories, each day, without resolution, amplifying anxiety. Was the jury divided? Were they stuck on a single piece of evidence? Were they wrestling with the same doubts that had haunted the case from the beginning? No one knew, and that not knowing echoed the uncertainty that had defined the cold case for years. Inside the jury room, the past was dismantled and rebuilt again, this time without lawyers to guide the process. Jurors compared notes, revisited testimony, argued over interpretations, and confronted their own biases as they tried to separate emotion from obligation. Some focused on the science, trusting the numbers and probabilities to anchor their conclusions. Others fixated on the inconsistencies, unable to move past the feeling that too much had been lost to time. The routine traffic stop was debated again and again, alternately framed as a breakthrough and a red flag, a symbol of progress or a reminder of randomness. The family waited with a patience honed by years of disappointment, trying not to read too much into the delays, trying not to imagine outcomes they could not control. Each update from the court was met with restrained acknowledgement, a learned response born of experience. They had waited this long, they told themselves, they could wait a little longer. Yet the strain was visible, etched into small gestures, into the way hands clasped and unclasped, into the way eyes searched faces for reassurance that could not be given. The town followed the deliberations with an intensity that bordered on fixation. News outlets tracked the hours, analysts speculated about jury dynamics, and conversations everywhere seemed to circle back to the same question: would this finally be the moment when the Ohio 2007 cold case reached a definitive end? For some, the anticipation carried hope. the belief that a verdict would allow them to finally set the story down. For others, it carried dread, the fear that any outcome would leave something unresolved, that certainty would remain just out of reach. As deliberations stretched on, the possibility of a hung jury crept into public consciousness, a reminder that the legal system does not guarantee resolution, even after years of effort. That possibility felt like a cruel echo of the past, a return to limbo after so much motion. It underscored a truth that had been present all along. Solving a cold case is not the same as healing from it. The process can move forward, but the impact lingers, shaping perceptions and relationships in ways no verdict can fully undo. When the jury finally signaled that they had reached a decision, the reaction was immediate and visceral. People rushed back into the courtroom, hearts pounding with the knowledge that this moment, whatever it brought, would become part of the case's permanent record. The defendant was led back in, expression controlled, while the family took their seats once more, bracing for words that would define the rest of their lives in ways both expected and unimaginable. The room held its breath, suspended between past and future. The verdict itself, when read, did not release the tension so much as transform it. Whatever the outcome, it arrived weighted with years of expectation, years of unanswered questions, years of stories told and retold without conclusion. For some, it felt like justice finally taking shape. For others, it felt incomplete, a legal answer that could not address the deeper uncertainties that still lingered. The Ohio 2007 cold case had reached a legal milestone, but emotionally, it remained unsettled, its echoes too deep to be silenced by a single decision. In the aftermath, reactions fractured along familiar lines. Supporters of the verdict spoke of vindication, of faith restored in a system capable of reaching back across time. Critics pointed to lingering doubts, to evidence that still felt thin, to the uncomfortable reality that the past had been reconstructed under pressure rather than preserved intact. The debate did not end with the verdict. It intensified, spilling into editorials, online forums, and private conversations where the case continued to live on, reshaped by perspective and belief. What became increasingly clear was that the Ohio 2007 cold case, even after a verdict, refused to settle into a single, agreed-upon truth. It had been broken open, examined, and judged, but it had not been resolved in the way people had imagined all those years ago. The trial had provided answers, but also exposed how fragile those answers could be when built on memories and evidence stretched across time. And as the courtroom emptied once again, leaving behind only the faint echo of proceedings concluded, the sense lingered that this story, like so many cold cases before it, was not finished speaking, that its shadow would continue to fall across the community long after the legal chapter had closed. After the verdict was read and the courtroom slowly exhaled, the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before it. It was not the silence of relief, nor the clean quiet of resolution, but something more complex, layered with relief for some, disappointment for others, and a shared unease that no legal outcome could fully resolve what had been set in motion back in 2007. People filed out in measured steps, avoiding eye contact, as if acknowledging one another might force them to confront emotions they were not ready to name. The Ohio 2007 cold case had reached a conclusion on paper, but in reality it had only shifted shape, trading uncertainty for controversy. The family emerged into the glare of cameras, their faces composed but strained, carrying an expression that defied easy interpretation. For years they had imagined this moment, had rehearsed what closure might feel like, and now that it had arrived, it felt incomplete, almost unfamiliar. Words of sympathy and congratulations blurred together, each one well-intentioned and insufficient. They spoke carefully, thanking those who had not forgotten, acknowledging the verdict without fully embracing it, aware that anything they said would be dissected and remembered. Their grief had never been simple, and the verdict did not simplify it. It merely gave it a new frame. The defendant was led away, his future now defined by a decision rendered long after the night that changed everything. Supporters and critics alike searched his expression for meaning, for confirmation of their own beliefs, but found little to hold on to. In the days that followed, his past was revisited yet again, this time through the lens of guilt or injustice, depending on who is telling the story. Details that had once seemed trivial were now used to argue inevitability or misfortune, and the line between fact and interpretation grew thinner with each retelling. In the town, the verdict reopened conversations people thought they had finished years earlier. Some felt vindicated, convinced that the system, slow as it was, had finally delivered accountability. Others felt unsettled, troubled by the idea that certainty had been manufactured from fragments, that the need for an ending had outweighed the ambiguity embedded in the evidence. Old debates resurfaced about police practices, about whose voices mattered in the early days of an investigation, about whether the outcome would have been different if the case had been pursued with greater urgency from the start. Media coverage shifted tone almost overnight, moving from anticipation to analysis, from live updates to long retrospectives that questioned how the case had reached this point. Commentators revisited the routine traffic stop that had sparked everything, framing it alternately as a triumph of modern policing and a troubling example of randomness dictating justice. The phrase "cold case broken" was scrutinized, its promise of clarity weighed against the lingering doubts that refused to disappear. The story was no longer about discovery alone, it was about consequence. For investigators, the verdict brought a complicated mix of validation and introspection. Years of work had finally produced an outcome, yet the process had exposed weaknesses they could not ignore. They reviewed the case internally, acknowledging what had gone wrong in 2007, what had been missed, and what had only become visible with time and technology. There was pride in seeing the case move forward, but also a sobering awareness that success had come late, and that delay carried its own cost, measured not just in years but in trust. The courtroom itself returned to normalcy, hosting new cases, new conflicts, its walls absorbing fresh narratives as if the echoes of the past could be overwritten. But for those who had been part of this trial, the space remained charged, a place where time had folded in on itself, where a moment from 2007 had been dragged into the present and forced into the light. Every bench and table seemed to carry the residue of that collision, a reminder that justice does not erase history, it confronts it imperfectly. As weeks passed, appeals were discussed, legal strategies reconsidered, and the possibility of future proceedings hovered in the background, preventing the story from settling. The verdict was final in one sense and provisional in another, subject to review, reinterpretation, and challenge. This ongoing uncertainty kept the case alive in public consciousness, ensuring that it remained a topic of debate rather than a closed chapter. For some, this felt like a failure of closure. For others, it felt like an honest reflection of reality. The family returned to a quieter life, one shaped by the knowledge that the world would always remember their loss through headlines and court records. They navigated a new version of grief, one no longer defined solely by not knowing, but by living with an answer that did not fully satisfy. There were moments of relief, moments of anger, moments when the past felt unbearably close. The verdict had not ended their journey, it had changed its terrain. In conversations across the community, the case became shorthand for larger questions about time and justice. How long is too long to wait? What does proof look like when memories fade and evidence ages? Is resolution better than uncertainty, even when it leaves doubts behind? These questions lingered without consensus, surfacing whenever the case was mentioned, whenever another cold case made headlines, whenever the illusion of finality was tested by reality. The Ohio 2007 cold case had been broken open by chance, carried forward by persistence, and concluded by law, yet it resisted the simplicity of a solved mystery. It existed now as a cautionary tale, a symbol of both possibility and limitation, of how far the system can reach back and how much can be lost along the way. Its legacy was not just the verdict, but the conversations it forced, the discomfort it sustained, and the awareness it sharpened. As time moved on, the urgency faded, but the imprint remained. The case slipped from daily news into periodic remembrance, resurfacing on anniversaries and in discussions about forensic advances or judicial reform. Each time it reemerged, it carried the same unresolved tension, the sense that something essential remained just out of grasp. And in that lingering space, between resolution and doubt, the true weight of the Ohio 2007 cold case could still be felt, a reminder that some stories do not end cleanly, but continue to echo, quietly, long after the final words have been spoken. Time did what it always does after the headlines fade. It stretched the story thin, pulling it out across months and years until only its sharpest edges still cut through public memory. The Ohio 2007 cold case no longer dominated conversations, but it never truly disappeared either. It lingered in the background, resurfacing in quiet moments, in passing references, in the uneasy pause that followed whenever someone mentioned how long justice can take and what it costs while it's waiting. The verdict had closed a legal chapter, but the emotional ledger remained open, its balance unsettled. For the family, life became a careful exercise in coexistence with the past. There was no dramatic turning point, no instant shift from grief to peace. Instead, there were small, almost invisible adjustments, learning which questions to answer and which to deflect, deciding when to speak and when silence was safer, navigating a world that assumed resolution had brought relief. Some days, the verdict felt like a shield, a way to push back against the endless speculation that had defined the years before. Other days, it felt like a reminder of everything that could never be undone, a fixed marker attached permanently to their loss. The town adjusted too, settling into a new normal that incorporated the case without fully confronting it. Businesses reopened and closed, families moved in and out, and children grew up hearing fragments of the story without ever feeling its full weight. To them, 2007 sounded distant, abstract, a date disconnected from lived experience. Yet for older residents, the memory remained vivid, tied to specific streets and familiar faces, to the sense of rupture that had once shaken their confidence in the ordinary. The cold case had become part of the town's identity, a reference point that shaped how people understood safety and trust. Within law enforcement, the case took on a different afterlife. It became a training example, a file pulled out during briefings to illustrate both perseverance and caution. Officers discussed what had worked, what had failed, and what might have changed the outcome if done differently. The routine traffic stop was analyzed again and again, not as a miracle, but as a reminder of how fragile the boundary between obscurity and exposure can be. The lesson was sobering. Justice often advances unevenly, propelled by chance as much as design. At the same time, critics continued to examine the case from the outside, publishing analyses that questioned the strength of the evidence and the influence of narrative momentum. Some argued that the pressure to finally solve the Ohio 2007 cold case had created a tunnel vision that narrowed possibilities too quickly. Others countered that waiting any longer would have risked losing the chance for accountability altogether. The debate reflected a deeper discomfort with the idea that truth, once delayed, can never be recovered in its original form, only approximated. The defendant's story, too, entered a new phase, one defined by appeals and legal maneuvering rather than dramatic revelation. The court filings replaced testimony, and arguments shifted from facts to procedures, from what happened to how it was handled. Each appeal reopened wounds and reignited discussions, reminding everyone involved that the legal system rarely offers a clean endpoint. For supporters, these efforts represented a necessary safeguard against error. For detractors, they felt like an attempt to evade responsibility. Either way, they ensured the case remained alive, suspended between finality and revision. Media attention flared intermittently, usually tied to anniversaries or developments in the appeals process. Articles revisited the original disappearance, the years of silence, the shock of the arrest, often framed through the lens of hindsight. Each retelling emphasized different elements, shaping public perception in subtle ways. Over time, the story fragmented into multiple versions, each reflecting the priorities and beliefs of the teller. The idea of a single, authoritative narrative faded, replaced by a mosaic of interpretations. In quieter moments, the case provoked more personal reflections. People wondered about the roads not taken, the conversations that never happened, the assumptions that went unchallenged. They asked themselves how well they truly knew the people around them, how easily routine could mask something darker. The cold case had exposed a vulnerability that lingered, an awareness that certainty is often an illusion maintained by distance from tragedy. Once that distance collapses, it never fully returns. For those who had worked the case, the sense of responsibility did not end with the verdict. Some retired, carrying the weight of the investigation with them into a quieter life. Others moved on to new assignments, applying hard-earned lessons to fresh cases. Yet the Ohio 2007 cold case remained a touchstone, a reminder of the limits of their work and the consequences of delay. It shaped how they approached missing persons reports, how quickly they escalated concerns, how carefully they documented even the smallest detail. As years passed, the language around the case softened. It was no longer described with urgency, but with reflection. The phrase "cold case broken" lost its immediacy, becoming almost symbolic, a shorthand for a particular era of investigation and a particular set of expectations. What remained was the recognition that breaking a case does not necessarily mend what it fractures, that resolution can coexist with doubt, and that the past, once disturbed, rarely settles back into silence. The community learned to live with that ambiguity. It surfaced in memorials that focused less on answers and more on remembrance, in conversations that prioritized empathy over certainty. The case had taught them that some truths arrive too late to heal completely, and that waiting for perfect closure can be a form of paralysis. Instead, they learned to carry the story forward in pieces, acknowledging its impact without letting it define every moment. In this way, the Ohio 2007 cold case transformed from an active investigation into a quiet undercurrent, shaping attitudes and decisions long after the legal dust had settled. It remained a presence rather than an event, a reminder etched into collective memory. And even as time continued its work of erosion, smoothing the sharpest edges, the case resisted erasure, holding its place as a testament to how deeply an unanswered night can imprint itself on a community, and how, even when answers come, they rarely arrive alone. With distance came a different kind of clarity, not the clarity of answers, but the clarity of consequence. The Ohio 2007 cold case no longer demanded attention the way it once had, yet its presence could still be felt in subtle shifts, in how people reacted to news alerts about missing persons, in how quickly concern escalated when someone failed to check in. The case had recalibrated instincts, replacing complacency with caution, reminding everyone that disappearance does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it slips in quietly, disguised as routine, and by the time it is noticed, the damage is already done. The roads where the story began looked ordinary again. Traffic flowed without hesitation, patrol lights flickered on and off for reasons that rarely made the news, and most drivers never considered how close they might come to history with every stop, every glance in the rearview mirror. The routine traffic stop that had broken the cold case became a reference point in law enforcement discussions, but for the public it faded into abstraction, a detail repeated so often it lost its shock. Still, for those who knew the story well, it remained unsettling, a reminder that justice can hinge on moments so small they are almost invisible. Inside institutions, the case continued to exert quiet pressure. Policies were reviewed, training updated, databases expanded, all in response to lessons learned too late to change the past but early enough, perhaps, to influence the future. There was a renewed emphasis on urgency, on treating the early hours of a disappearance as critical rather than routine. Officers spoke openly about the weight of delay, about how easily a case can slip from solvable to stagnant. The Ohio 2007 cold case became a benchmark, cited not with pride alone, but with caution. For the family, anniversaries remained the hardest. Dates carried a gravity that others could not feel, pulling them backward despite their efforts to move forward. They marked time not just by years past, but by versions of themselves, by who they were before the disappearance and who they had become after the verdict. Friends assumed the worst was over, that the hardest part had been resolved. But grief does not follow legal timelines. It adapts, reshapes itself, finds new ways to surface, especially when the world expects quiet acceptance instead of ongoing struggle. The defendant's name receded from daily conversation but never fully vanished. It appeared in legal updates, in occasional opinion pieces, in debates about wrongful convictions and delayed justice. Each mention reignited familiar arguments, each argument reinforcing how divided perception remained. To some, the case stood as proof that patience and persistence could overcome time. To others, it embodied the danger of certainty constructed from fragments. Both interpretations coexisted, neither fully displacing the other, mirroring the unresolved tension at the heart of the story. Younger generations encountered the case differently. For them, it arrived prepackaged, summarized in articles and documentaries that framed it as a lesson rather than a lived experience. They absorbed it as part of a broader conversation about crime and technology, about how data and chance intersect. The emotional immediacy was dulled by distance, but the cautionary element remained. The story warned them that the past is never truly sealed, that it can resurface unpredictably, demanding attention long after the moment of origin has faded. In academic and legal circles, the case became material for study, cited in discussions about cold case methodology, evidentiary standards, and the psychology of delayed trials. Scholars debated whether the outcome represented progress or compromise, whether the system had succeeded or merely functioned as designed. These discussions were clinical, abstracted, yet they carried real implications, shaping how future cases might be approached, how much weight would be given to aging evidence, how narratives would be constructed in the absence of certainty. What lingered most stubbornly was the sense of interruption. The Ohio 2007 cold case had interrupted lives, routines, assumptions, and even after its legal conclusion, that interruption remained unresolved. It was embedded in the way people spoke about safety, in the hesitation before trusting appearances, in the quiet acknowledgement that not all dangers announce themselves. The case had altered the emotional landscape, leaving behind a heightened awareness that could not be undone. As years continued to pass, the story's edges softened, but its core remained intact. It was referenced less frequently, but with more gravity, as if repetition had stripped away spectacle and left only meaning. The phrase cold case itself carried new weight, no longer just a category, but a reminder of how time complicates truth. Breaking a cold case, people realized, is not a singular event. It is a process that unfolds long after the headlines fade, shaping lives in ways that cannot be measured by verdicts alone. The Ohio 2007 cold case existed now in a space between memory and warning, its significance evolving as circumstances changed. It no longer demanded answers. It demanded reflection. Reflection on what is owed to the missing, on how much faith should be placed in systems designed by fallible humans, on the cost of waiting too long to act. These reflections did not resolve the past, but they influenced the future, quietly, persistently. And so the case endured, not as an active investigation, not as a daily news item, but as an undercurrent shaping decisions and perceptions. It reminded those who remembered it closely that justice is rarely clean, rarely timely, and rarely complete. It reminded those who encountered it later that history is not static, that it can reassert itself without warning. In this way, the Ohio 2007 cold case continued to speak, not loudly, not urgently, but with a steady insistence that some stories, once told, never fully release the people who hear them. In the end, what remained was not the verdict, not the headlines, not even the long chain of evidence and argument that had carried the Ohio 2007 cold case from silence back into the light. What remained was a feeling, subtle but persistent, like a low-frequency hum beneath everyday life, reminding those who listen closely that the past does not stay buried simply because time passes. It waits. It lingers. It presses softly against the present, searching for the smallest fracture through which it can return. Years after the courtroom emptied for the last time, people still spoke about the case in lowered voices, as if volume itself might disturb something fragile. They spoke about where they were when the disappearance first made the news, about how ordinary the night had seemed, about how quickly certainty dissolved into speculation. Memory had edited those early days, smoothing some edges, sharpening others, but the core sensation remained unchanged, the shock of realizing that something could vanish without explanation, right in the middle of a place that believed itself safe. The roads were quieter in memory than they had ever been in reality. The intersections where nothing visibly happened carried more weight than those marked by tragedy because they represented the unknown, the moment when a life slipped out of view without leaving a clear trace. People drove past them without slowing, unaware that for some, those stretches of asphalt still felt charged, still carried the possibility of unanswered questions rising up through the pavement. The landscape itself had absorbed the story, holding it without comment. For the family, the future unfolded without ceremony. There was no finish line, no point at which the case could be set down and left behind. Instead, there was continuity, the quiet work of living alongside loss that had been reshaped but never erased. They learned that answers, once obtained, do not replace what was taken. They only change the shape of the absence. Some days were lighter, some heavier, but all of them carried the same underlying truth, that love does not resolve when mystery ends, and grief does not obey the logic of courts. The community carried its own version of that truth. Trust returned slowly, unevenly, and never quite to its original form. People became more attentive, more inclined to question, less willing to assume that familiarity equaled safety. The case had left behind a residue of awareness, a collective instinct sharpened by experience. It was not paranoia, but it was not innocence either. It was the understanding that normalcy can fracture without warning, and that vigilance is often born from regret. Within the system, the case lived on as a reference, a warning, and sometimes a reassurance. It proved that time does not make truth impossible, but it also proved that time extracts a price for every delay. Investigators who studied the file years later saw not just a crime, but a sequence of decisions, some made under pressure, others made in routine moments when the stakes were not yet visible. They learned that cold cases are not only about what is missing, but about what is deferred, postponed, or underestimated. The phrase "cold case broken" endured, but it no longer carried triumph. It carried weight. It suggested effort and consequence rather than celebration. It acknowledged that breaking a case does not restore what was lost, and it does not erase the years lived in uncertainty. It simply marks the moment when silence was interrupted, when the past was forced to speak, even if its voice arrived altered by time. As new stories emerged, new disappearances captured attention. The Ohio 2007 cold case receded further into the archive, yet it remained present in comparison, invoked as a reminder of how long waiting can stretch and how unpredictable resolution can be. Each new case carried an echo of the old one, a faint resonance that shaped expectations and fears. The past informed the present, not through repetition, but through memory. And memory, unlike evidence, does not degrade neatly. It transforms. It blends fact with feeling, certainty with doubt. It resists closure. The case lived on in that space, neither fully resolved nor fully open, existing as a story people returned to when they needed to understand the cost of unanswered nights and delayed truths. It taught that some mysteries, even when addressed, leave behind a shadow that answers cannot fully disperse. In quiet moments, when the noise of debate and analysis faded, what surfaced was not outrage or satisfaction, but a sober recognition of fragility. How easily a life can diverge from expectation. How thin the line is between routine and rupture. How much depends on moments no one recognizes as important until they are long gone. These realizations did not demand action. They demanded awareness. The Ohio 2007 cold case did not end with certainty. It ended with reflection. Reflection on time, on justice, on the limits of knowledge, and on the enduring impact of absence. It settled into history not as a solved puzzle, but as a cautionary imprint, a reminder etched into collective consciousness. And long after the final ruling, long after the last appeal, its quiet message remained unchanged, that some stories never truly conclude, they only change the way they are remembered, continuing to echo softly, insistently, in the spaces between what is known and what can never be fully explained. Time moved on, as it always does, but it never moved cleanly past the case. It flowed around it, carrying fragments forward into new years, new conversations, new silences. For those who had lived through it, the Ohio 2007 cold case was no longer a headline but a presence, something felt rather than discussed, a story that surfaced without warning in the middle of unrelated moments. A passing siren, a late-night traffic stop, a news alert that arrived with the same cadence as the one that had changed everything years before. There was a strange intimacy to that recognition. People understood, sometimes without words, that they shared a memory shaped by uncertainty. They had learned to read between the lines of official statements, to notice what was said and what was carefully avoided. Even after the arrest, even after the label "cold case broken," there were questions that never found their way into records, questions that lived instead in pauses, in glances, in the way conversations drifted away from conclusions and back toward possibilities. The night itself refused to become static. It replayed differently depending on who remembered it. For some, it was sharp and immediate, every detail fixed in place. For others, it had blurred into atmosphere. Flashing lights reflected on wet pavement, a voice over the radio, a sense that something irreversible was unfolding just beyond view. Memory did not agree on specifics, but it agreed on impact. Something had gone wrong in a way that could not be undone. Investigators who revisited the case years later spoke about it with measured language, but their tone betrayed an undercurrent of respect for its complexity. They knew that resolution does not equal simplicity. They knew that a traffic stop, routine by definition, could become a hinge on which an entire narrative turns. The randomness of it lingered, unsettling in its implications. If this could happen here, under these conditions, then it could happen anywhere. For the younger generation, those who had been children or not yet born when the disappearance occurred, the case arrived as a story already shaped by distance. They encountered it through documentaries, articles, late-night discussions online. To them, it seemed almost unreal, a constructed narrative rather than a lived one. Yet even they felt its gravity. They sensed that beneath the facts lay something unresolved, something that resisted being neatly categorized as solved or unsolved. The language surrounding the case evolved. Early reports had been frantic, urgent, fueled by the hope of immediate answers. Later coverage grew analytical, retrospective, searching for meaning rather than resolution. Eventually, the tone shifted again, toward contemplation. The case became a reference point, a lens through which other mysteries were examined. It stopped being just one story and became part of a larger conversation about time, chance, and the limits of certainty. What endured most strongly was the awareness of how quickly normal life can fracture. One moment, a routine stop on a familiar road. The next, a chain of events that would ripple outward for decades. That contrast stayed with people. It shaped how they understood risk, how they interpreted coincidence, how they reacted to the unexpected. The case had taught them that danger does not always announce itself, and that history is often altered by moments that seem insignificant at first glance. There was no single image that defined the aftermath, no photograph that captured the full weight of what followed. Instead, there were countless small scenes, a family gathering with an empty chair, a community meeting where the same questions resurfaced, a detective closing a file with the knowledge that closure was incomplete. These moments did not make headlines, but they carried the real substance of the story. As years layered themselves on top of the original events, the case became quieter, but not weaker. Its power lay in persistence. It refused to fade entirely, refused to be reduced to a footnote. It lingered in the background of public consciousness, ready to re-emerge whenever discussions turned to justice delayed, to truth uncovered too late, to the fragile line between routine and catastrophe. And so the Ohio 2007 cold case continued to exist in a state of tension, suspended between conclusion and doubt. It had answers, but not peace. It had explanations, but not relief. It remained a reminder that some stories do not resolve into clarity, that even when the past is confronted, it can leave behind shadows that stretch far into the present. In the end, the case did not demand belief in a single version of events. It demanded recognition. Recognition of uncertainty. Recognition of loss that cannot be quantified. Recognition of the quiet endurance of those who live with unanswered questions long after the noise fades. And in that recognition, the story found its final form, not as a closed chapter, but as a lasting echo, embedded in memory, continuing to resonate whenever the night grows quiet and the road ahead seems, for just a moment, uncertain. The echo did not stop there. It never does. Even when the case slipped further into the past, even when new headlines replaced the old ones, the story retained a pulse, faint but steady, beating beneath the surface of ordinary life. People who had never met the victim, never spoken to the investigators, never stood near the scene, still felt it when they learned the details. They felt the imbalance, the sense that something about the narrative resisted finality, as if the truth itself had been disturbed and never fully settled back into place. Late at night, when traffic thinned and the roads stretched long and empty, the memory returned most vividly. A routine stop. A brief exchange. A decision made in seconds that would outlive everyone involved. The simplicity of it was what unsettled people most. There was no elaborate setup, no dramatic warning. Just the quiet mechanics of everyday procedure colliding with a hidden reality. That collision became the case's most enduring symbol, how easily the familiar can turn irreversible. The files remained archived, but they were never inert. Detectives spoke of them as living records, documents that continued to exert influence long after they were closed. Every page carried the weight of hindsight. Every photograph seemed to ask what had been missed, what had been misunderstood, what might have changed if one detail had been interpreted differently. The case did not accuse, but it did not absolve either. It existed in the space between intention and outcome. For the family, time softened nothing completely. It rearranged the pain, redistributed it across years and milestones, but it never erased it. Birthdays passed with an undercurrent of absence. Anniversaries arrived carrying both memory and fatigue. They learned to navigate a world that expected closure where none truly existed. To outsiders, the arrest suggested an ending. To them, it marked another transformation of grief, not its conclusion. The community's relationship with the case evolved into something quieter and more reflective. There were no longer public debates or urgent searches, but there was an awareness that lingered in shared glances and cautious habits. People remembered how confidence had once felt effortless, how safety had been assumed rather than questioned. The case had taken that assumption and fractured it, leaving behind a more complex understanding of risk and responsibility. The phrase Ohio 2007 cold case took on a different meaning as years passed. It no longer referred only to a specific investigation. It became shorthand for a particular kind of unease, a reminder that resolution does not always align with understanding, that answers can coexist with doubt, that knowing what happened does not necessarily explain why it mattered so deeply. In conversations, the case surfaced unexpectedly. Someone would mention a late-night stop, a stretch of highway, a news alert that felt familiar. The room would grow quieter, if only for a moment. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. The shared awareness that the past has a way of resurfacing, uninvited, demanding attention even when it offers no new information. What endured was not outrage, but vigilance. A heightened sensitivity to small details. An understanding that significance is often assigned after the fact. The case had taught people to look twice, to question assumptions, to resist the comfort of easy explanations. It left behind a subtle but lasting shift in perception, one that influenced choices in ways most never consciously acknowledged. And so the story settled into its final state, not as a closed file, but as a quiet influence. It lived on in habits changed, in caution learned, in memories that refused to fade completely. The Ohio 2007 cold case did not end with certainty or peace. It ended with awareness. Awareness of fragility. Awareness of consequence. Awareness that some moments, no matter how ordinary they appear, can carry a weight that stretches far beyond their brief existence. In that awareness, the case found its true legacy, not as a solved mystery, not as an unsolved one, but as a lasting imprint on those who encountered it. A reminder etched into time itself, whispering that the line between routine and tragedy is thinner than anyone wants to believe, and that once crossed, it leaves behind echoes that no verdict, no headline, and no passage of years can ever fully silence. The night did not announce itself as important. It never does. It arrived quietly, folded into routine, into habit, into the kind of ordinary hours that rarely earn a second thought. Streetlights hummed over empty lanes, their glow stretching thin across the asphalt. Radios murmured. Engines cooled. In Ohio, in 2007, nothing about the evening suggested it would one day be spoken about in the same breath as the words cold case. Nothing hinted that it would fracture time into before and after. The victim moved through that night without urgency, following familiar roads, surrounded by the comforting illusion of predictability. This was a place where people recognized each other's cars, where routes were memorized rather than questioned, where danger was something that belonged to distant cities and breaking news alerts. The community believed in patterns, in repetition, in the idea that tomorrow would look very much like today. That belief was about to be tested. When the first details emerged, they felt incomplete, oddly restrained. A person last seen here. A vehicle noted there. A window of time so narrow it felt unreal. Early reports leaned heavily on phrases like no signs of struggle and nothing out of the ordinary. Those words settled uneasily. They suggested not reassurance, but absence. An empty space where clarity should have been. The kind of absence that invites speculation before anyone is ready to name it. Investigators began where they always do, retracing steps, reconstructing movements, converting memory into timelines. They spoke with neighbors who offered small, uncertain details, fragments of observation that felt insignificant even as they were spoken. A sound that might have been a door. A car that could have been anyone's. A moment of hesitation that, in hindsight, seemed heavier than it had felt at the time. Each piece was logged, cataloged, weighed against others, but nothing aligned cleanly enough to form a picture. The location itself resisted interpretation. There were no obvious markers of violence, no visible disruption to suggest a sudden rupture. The quietness of the scene became its own problem. Silence can be more misleading than chaos. It allows too many possibilities to coexist. Investigators stood where the person had last been known to exist and felt the discomfort of uncertainty settle in. This was not a place that explained itself. As hours turned into days, the tone shifted. Concern replaced curiosity. The language hardened. Missing became missing under suspicious circumstances. Community members scanned the news for updates, reading between the lines, sensing that something was being withheld not out of secrecy, but because there was nothing solid to report. The lack of information became the story. The questions multiplied faster than the answers. Search efforts expanded outward in widening circles. Roads were driven again and again. Fields were checked, then rechecked. Volunteers moved through familiar spaces with unfamiliar purpose, looking not for something specific, but for anything that did not belong. Each discovery that turned out to be irrelevant deepened the frustration. Each false lead reinforced the same unsettling truth. Whatever had happened had left remarkably little behind. The family lived inside that uncertainty, suspended in a state that defied normal emotional boundaries. Hope and fear existed side by side, neither strong enough to eliminate the other. They learned quickly that waiting has its own weight, that it exhausts in ways action does not. Every phone call carried potential. Every knock at the door recalibrated expectations. Time slowed, then fractured, then began to blur. Law enforcement felt the pressure intensify. This was no longer a routine missing persons report. It was becoming something else, something heavier. Meetings grew longer. Theories grew more elaborate. Each one required a chain of assumptions that could not be verified. Accidental disappearance. Voluntary departure. Foul play hidden beneath the appearance of normalcy. None of them fully satisfied the evidence, yet none could be dismissed outright. The idea of a cold case was not spoken aloud at first. It hovered uncomfortably at the edges of discussion, an outcome no one wanted to accept so early. Cold cases imply time lost, momentum gone, answers delayed indefinitely. But with each passing week, the investigation felt less like a forward movement and more like a careful maintenance of unresolved questions. Files thickened. Confidence thinned. The community began to change subtly. Conversations grew cautious. Parents lingered longer when their children were late. Routine stops on dark roads felt different, charged with a significance they had never carried before. People realized that familiarity had been a shield, and that shield had cracked. The case was no longer about one person. It was about vulnerability, about the realization that safety could be interrupted without warning. Media attention followed its own rhythm, surging, then receding, then returning with new angles that promised insight but delivered little clarity. Headlines used the word mysterious until it lost precision, until it became a placeholder for ignorance. Each article reinforced the same unsettling narrative. Someone had vanished into a night that refused to explain itself. Behind the scenes, investigators revisited early assumptions, questioning whether the ordinary details had been misread. They re-examined the timeline, looking for gaps so small they had initially seemed irrelevant. A few minutes unaccounted for. A deviation from a usual route. A routine interaction that might not have been routine at all. The possibility that something crucial had occurred in plain sight began to feel less remote. And then there was the road. Always the road. It threaded through every theory, every reconstruction. It was the constant, the silent witness that could not speak. A place of movement, of transition, where encounters are brief and consequences can be permanent. The more investigators focused on it, the more the case seemed to orbit around the idea that what happened was not dramatic, not overtly violent, but quietly decisive. By the time the word cold was finally attached to the case, it did not feel premature. It felt inevitable. The initial urgency had cooled into something more rigid, more archival. Leads were still followed, but with diminishing expectation. The case entered a new phase, one defined less by action and more by endurance. Waiting became institutionalized. Yet even as the investigation slowed, the sense of unease did not. It settled into the community like a low fog, altering perceptions without fully obscuring daily life. People learned to live alongside the unanswered questions, but they did not forget them. The night remained unresolved. The absence remained unexplained. And somewhere within that unresolved space, the Ohio 2007 cold case began its long, silent occupation of memory, holding its secrets close, refusing, for now, to release them.